And hello, my name is Keith Holden, and this is Squawknomics. Today we have with us a prominent fund manager from Meton Capital. Did I say that right? Joanne Baynham.
Yes, hi.
Yes,
to meet you.
nice to meet you.
Thanks for your time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having time to be with us today. I would like to ask you about the number one thing that's gripping markets right now. It's really the litmus test of the global economy right now, and that is the set of shadow banking tactical defaults that are coming and perhaps nicking the perceived perfect porcelain that China's presented itself as. We had the China credit equals gold trust, and now we've got the Yellen trust default, and we've got Lynch and Cole that's connected to a lot of co-guaranteed debt. And the concern is that there's going to be a cascade of debt defaults in China. Now, China has chosen to bail out, and this is creating moral hazard. So I want to talk about what effects this has on development in investor confidence in China.
Well, I think if you look at what's happening with the Chinese stock market at the moment, that's the first point of reference. It's not doing terribly well. I mean, beginning of this year, we saw the Shanghai almost going to 2,000. I think it then recovered somewhat since then. And people are concerned about this because China has been the global growth engine for a very long time now. I also think from my trip here recently, it's been very interesting to see how no one trusts the numbers coming out of China. So the shadow banking is very important because it's created an enormous amount of credit growth in a region which appears to be slowing despite government's best attempts to give the impression that it's not slowing. But your question of moral hazard is a very good one because whilst they keep bailing it out, and apparently anonymously bailing these wealth management products out, they're telling people that it's fine to go put your money into them because don't worry, you'll be looked after. But most people think it's the Chinese government bailing these wealth management products out.
So you think it's the PBOC that's directing China Development Bank, for instance, and
Yes.
saying, you bail out?
Well, there is look, I've got nothing to prove this, but the fact is a lot of Chinese banks are actually owned by the Chinese government. So, and why would they not come out and say it is? If it was the Chinese government and they were trying to avoid moral hazard, they'd happily do it.
Well,
that's why they're being anonymous at the moment, and it just makes one feel uncomfortable. You know, don't quote me in the sense that I don't know, but that's the impression one is getting.
Right.
And I think it is concerning because when you have an economy that grows as quickly as China is, with interest rates at the wrong price because of these wealth management products, you end up going into sub-economic developments and you go into projects that don't make money. And I think we're seeing that on the stock exchange, and that's why people don't trust the earnings numbers because there's excess capital going into projects, not giving the return of capital because the interest rate cost to start with is the wrong price.
Right.
That's the whole moral
And the
hazard
solutions will have to be China will have to print more money to make up for the shortfalls and so on and so forth. If it does not make it back from its investments in Africa and so on, that it may very well be its gambit as far as to turn its financial house around.
Just on this point on China, I do think the world is worried about it and we are definitely watching it. The only thing is China has massive surplus savings. So unlike the States where you had the subprime crisis in 2007, 2008, China is quite different. It can bail a lot of these banks out and still be business as usual. But you know, ultimately something's going to go wrong, but we're not sure the timing of that. This does not feel like another 08 scenario to me.
So regardless of the fact that there's 15 trillion of incremental credit that's created in China in terms of recreating the entire U.S. banking sector in 5 years, you don't see that as an issue that China can't work itself through without
Well, the thing with
tears?
China, it just has massive numbers whichever way you look at it. So people are allowed to quote 5-year numbers on Chinese banks, etc. But it is an enormous economy, and it does have, I think, 3.3 trillion in reserves. So it is able to fix things a lot easier than other economies. Not for 1 second am I saying it's not concerning. It's definitely on everyone's radar screens. And if you look at emerging market currencies, for instance, particularly the ones that are reliant on commodity markets, they're feeling the pain. They are concerned. But do I think this is going to lead to another almighty crash in stock markets? Famous last words. At the moment, no. But I think China is slowing, and that will have implications for world growth.
Interesting. We're talking about really, to the West, these are almost bizarre financial vehicles that are being created and are being used in China. And latest of which is something that Baidu, Taobao, and Tencent are doing, where they are essentially creating saving vehicles for people that already use their portals and saying, hey, you can park your money in our portals. We'll give you as much as 8%. We'll give you interest on the day. We will fluctuate the daily interest depending on the return that day, and we will allow you to pull out your money at any time. And so people putting in about 70,000 renminbi are making 16, 12 renminbi a day, which pales what you're getting in terms of Western markets. Now, how I understand this is structured is that they basically take everyone's savings, they commingle it all into one account, and they put it into a high interest savings account. That's about 90%. Then, from what I've heard, they put in about 10%, where it's the speculative, and from there they're able to generate those higher interest rates. Does this look like a precipitous arrangement to you, or is this a result of the fact that people have been getting such low interest in China for so long that people are finally just saying enough with it? And could these three internet portals, Baidu, Taobao, and Tencent, could they be the new ICBC, CDB, and
they become banks in
Bank of China? Right. They're trying to become banks.
They are trying to monetize and become banks. I think you have to look at what interest rates are in China at the moment and work out where 8% is relative to that level. But as you said, it does steadily fluctuate. I worry about how they're underwriting that. I worry about where the money is coming to pay the individual bottom end, because it does have a wealth management product feel to it. And I'm obviously not an authority on this, but it does make me slightly uncomfortable. But it's very exciting if you're a shareholder in Baidu or Tencent, which, funny enough, I come from Africa, and Naspers is one of the largest shares in our stock exchange and is a major shareholder of Tencent. And all we will see is that share price go up. Not only is it part of their savings vehicles, it also owns WeChat. Now, if you saw what happened last night in the States, we saw, Facebook buy WhatsApp. And when originally the deal was announced,
$50 per user.
They are, but I believe, I could be wrong here, but I believe Barclays have come out and said it's not a bad price, it's worth even more. The problem with all these things is how do you monetize it? So now we have Tencent and Baidu actually starting to monetize their massive internet portals and allowing to make money out of it. I do worry about who bails them out. Because unlike the story we talked about a few minutes earlier, where it was a banking sector and the Chinese government can bail these companies out, Tencent are owned by minority shareholders, majority. It's not a government-controlled company.
Correct.
What happens then? And this is becoming a lot more interesting. But I don't know what the wealth management product's giving us interest rates. I thought it was more like 12%. So maybe 8% is the correct value. I'm not sure, but we'll watch this space carefully.
Interesting. It seems that Taobao and Baidu and Tencent seem to have noticed a little bit of dithering in the banking sector and decided to move because the banking sector wasn't willing to move as far as for the average people in China to gain a return. So I think that'd be a very interesting development. The other interesting development is an ongoing one that the renminbi being frozen at 6.83 has now advanced to almost about 6. And that's created a rise in workers' salaries. That's making China less of a bargain, and businesses are looking elsewhere. Definitely looking towards Africa. And I want to ask you, what country in Africa appears poised to benefit from this development? And conversely, how is China going to deal with this loss of competitiveness on costs now that the cost benefit is going to places like Africa and Eastern Europe?
Our impression is investment in Africa is not about cost competitiveness. It's not about the fact that they're trying to find cheap labor, because coming from Africa, our impression of most of the Chinese investments, they bring their own people with them. I think what is more interesting is what it means to the US, because you're seeing companies now saying Chinese wage inflation is picking up. People are very productive in the US. It's closer to our actual markets where we're buying goods, and you're starting to see that sort of outsourcing that we all spoke about many years ago. Now people are talking about insourcing. So from an Africa perspective, I don't see the Chinese wage increases affecting Africa. I see it affecting the US a lot more. What we are seeing in Africa is massive inward investment from China, but they're not creating growth for Africans necessarily. And I think a lot of South Africans you speak to will tell you they're quite concerned about China's investment because it's not sustainable growth for Africa. You know, a lot of countries around the world, when they get investment, they say you've got to hire our own people. We're not convinced that's happening.
Get trained,
and those people get trained. But
skills.
if you go to places like Botswana, what you will see, the Chinese are coming in, they're buying up the rights to mine certain areas, but they're bringing their own people with them. They're actually creating communities. I believe in Angola there are Chinese communities. So that's not good from a let's train Africans perspective. But yeah, I certainly don't see it from a cost competitiveness perspective. I see it from more from a let's go buy cheap commodities, let's get it off the ground, transport it, and take it back to China.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it's definitely not a labour issue because, with all due respect, I think Africans are not remotely as productive on the whole as the Chinese are. And I think living there, I can see the very different work ethic in Asia to the one that you have in Africa.
Interesting.
So yeah, but it's more a US issue. It's more a question of let's start building plants back here. A lot of the IT companies will bring productivity back to America, which is quite bullish for the American growth story.
Very interesting. We're talking about American growth story in Africa. We have the rise of the renminbi that's been bringing manufacturing back to the United States, and we are seeing all of this happening in the backdrop of a global QE taper. Going back home for a second, how is this going to affect the U.S.? I really want to touch on the point where you mentioned in your interview on CNBC in South Africa, where you said the Gini coefficient is the most extreme it's been since the 1950s. And so
it's 1929 actually, I think is the number I referred to because
1929.
1929. If you look back in history, and this is from Mark Faber that I actually have information from, so it's not my own original thoughts. But if you look at what toppled the stock markets in the 1930s, with a lot to do with the fact the centre couldn't hold, the rich became so obscenely rich, the poor were so poor, and we are seeing that today again. I'm not sure, the problem with this information, it's awful for people living in those situations. It doesn't necessarily mean the stock market's going to crash. But it was just an interesting point for me to see that we are moving back to a world where, you know, Americans today have money and they've had it better. But if you're 50 million people on food stamps in the US, it's pretty shocking. And it's not just a US phenomenon, it's happening everywhere. I mean, why are luxury goods companies making so much money? It's because there are so many very, very rich people out there.
And is the Gini coefficient being aggravated by the advance of automation in advanced OECD markets? Is that, in your case, exacerbating the situation? Or how do you see the creative destruction in the automation of jobs being obsolete and so on and so forth?
Well, what you're seeing in the Gini coefficient is the unskilled workers, the ones that take most of the pain. So when you have automation,
repetitive, non-complex.
Yes. You know, somebody interviewed me recently said, but my staff in London are all asking for massive salary increases. If you've got skills in the world today, you're okay. You're getting nice salary increases. You're not worried about automation. It's the guys at the bottom end that are struggling most with that. But apart from that, I think the biggest issue is interest rates. With interest rates so low, capital has no desire to employ people. It's far better off doing financial engineering. So if you look at what companies have been doing recently, when they look at their earnings numbers coming out, they don't talk about, okay, the future looks brighter, let's spend money on capital projects and manufacturing. They're saying, I'll buy our shares back.
Let's rehypothecate.
Yeah, and financial engineering. So, and that does not create jobs. It also takes power away from labour. So labour, if you're unskilled at the moment at the bottom end, it's never been worse for you.
What about people's bailout?
People's bailout?
Instead of bailing out the banks, what if Main Street was bailed out? What if Paulson, instead of bailing out the banks, instead gave $10,000 to every working men and woman in America to pay down debts and to basically they could use that money as free to develop businesses and so on and so forth. How do you think that would have turned out if we didn't have what we have now, where we have money volatility at a very low rate in the U.S. That basically suggests that there's money that is being created, is locked up in accounts and not making its way to Main Street. So if it was done the other way around, and if there was a people's bailout, how do you think that would have ended up?
It's very interesting. I think the sort of money printing, like helicopter Bernanke type argument, just go to the man on the street. I think that was always the last resort. And it might have worked if people wanted to spend the money. The problem with giving people money and they don't spend it and they save it, he's done nothing. So you're back to your comment about what we have done is reduce interest rates, give banks the ability to recapitalise, but they in turn are still not lending money, because we talk about enormous amount of money supply in the world, but the velocity of money, the movement of that money to mainstream, I mean, as you pointed out, hasn't happened yet. So yeah, it might have worked, who knows? It didn't work in Japan, people still not spending any money. I mean, they're slowly starting to do it now, but it's quite a dangerous experiment. And I mean, how do you physically do it? Do you go to everyone's bank accounts and deposit money?
So you're saying it was a dangerous experiment either way?
I think it is a dangerous experiment every way. I mean, I think central bankers is a giant experiment, and I think there's a huge hope it works. You only see Mark Carney recently change his forward guidance on unemployment, and Janet Yellen's also backtracking now on her forward guidance on central bank policy. I mean, look, I'm not a central banker, but the impression I'm getting is they don't know what they're doing at the moment.
Do you see the formation of a coordinated global taper as far as major OECD economies that are going to taper at the same time? And if so, what commodities look most vulnerable going forward in 2014?
Well, I don't see a global coordinated taper. I think the US is tapering and probably will continue to do so, just if it's data dependent. So this is not a weather-related study of US growth, she won't taper. The Bank of England has made it quite clear recently that despite things getting better, they're still quite nervous to do anything about it. So maybe those two banks start tapering. The Japanese aren't going to taper for a while because that economy is still, it's picking up. But then you have terrible trade numbers coming out this week that were shocking. You still don't have wage inflation. So Abenomics is still very far from over. So I don't think the Bank of Japan tapering. The ECB hasn't even raised liquidity. They need to actually start cutting rates, and none of us quite know how they're going to do it, but they need to get liquidity into that market, so they're certainly not going to taper. So I don't think there's a global coordinated taper going on. Back to your question of emerging markets, I'm far more worried about what happens in China than I am worried about Janet Yellen. I think what you are seeing is people are taking money out of emerging markets because they're feeling more positive about growth in the US.
Do you think Zhou Xiaochuan has more effect on global equity markets, global commodities, and what Zhou Xiaochuan does, rather than what Janet Yellen does at this point?
Yes, I do. And that's because I live in South Africa and I've seen our currency come out to the cosh. Our currency is very much more related to what happens in China than it does what happens to Janet Yellen. So what you saw this week, when the PMI numbers out of China came out, the rand massively weakened. It had been strengthening under 11, it started to weaken. What Janet Yellen does has less bearing these days, to me, than what happens in China. But that's particularly emerging market economies that are reliant on commodity markets. They're not all reliant on commodity markets. You might find the Hang Seng, for instance, is more reliant on what Janet Yellen says, because that's all about interest rates.
Interesting. And this all goes back towards back in the day when China would make a currency revaluation move. Within 30 minutes, the central bank of Malaysia would make those same moves. So it's interesting that you're seeing more coordination towards the world's moving more in lockstep as far as currency and other economic metrics, depending on what first Zhou Xiaochuan does and instead of what Janet Yellen does. It's very interesting.
It is very interesting. Are you done?
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.